be nearly quite so exhaustive. I'm simply finishing off this essay by Jung's Christ, a Symbol of the Self, found in Aion from paras 1 to 1 through to 6. So it's actually only 5 paragraphs. It does go for several pages. But yeah, we were talking about the Christ archetype. And so I won't bother to summarize the rest. I mean, we talked about a lot, and it was rather arcane. And so Jung. Quote, I would not like to end this chapter without a few final remarks that are forced on me by the importance of the material we've been discussing. The standpoint of a psychology whose subject is the phenomenology of the psyche is evidently something that's not easy to grasp and is very often misunderstood. If therefore, at the risk of repeating myself, I come back to fundamentals, I do so only in order to forestall certain wrong impressions which might be occasioned by what I've said, and to spare my reader unnecessary difficulties. So he's wanting to be really clear about what his position actually is to avoid misunderstanding. The parallel I have drawn here between Christ and the self is not to be taken as anything more than a psychological one. Just as the parallel with the fish is mythological. There is no question of any intrusion into the sphere of metaphysics, i.e., into the sphere of faith. The images of God and Christ, which man's religious fantasy projects, and cannot avoid being anthropomorphic. Sorry, let me rephrase that sentence. The images of God and Christ, which man's religious fantasy projects, cannot avoid being anthropomorphic, and are admitted to be so. Hence, they are capable of psychological elucidation, like any other symbols. Just as the ancients believed that they had said something important about Christ with their fish symbol, so it seemed to the alchemists that their parallel with the stone served to illuminate and deepen the meaning of the Christ image. So Jung is essentially saying here that the parallel that he's drawing is a psychological one, not a metaphysical one. He's referencing like his subject matter is empirical psychology and what people like the symbols that people give rise to about God as an example, rather than faith itself. So he says, yeah, he's saying that the images of God that we produce are necessarily anthropomorphic and that they're sort of open to elucidation as symbols. So they're sort of up for grabs. We can, it's the proper place of psychology to interpret such symbols. He goes on, in the course of time, the fish symbolism disappeared completely, and so likewise did the philosopher's stone. Concerning this latter symbol, however, there are plenty of statements to be found which show it in a special light. Views and ideas which attach such importance to the stone that one begins to wonder whether in the end it was Christ who was taken as a symbol of the stone, rather than the other way around. This marks a development which, with the help of certain ideas in the epistles of John and Paul, includes Christ in the realm of immediate inner experience and makes him appear as the figure of the total man. It also links up directly with the psychological evidence for the existence of an archetypal content, possessing all those qualities which are characteristic of the Christ image in its archaic and medieval forms, that being the self. Modern psychology is therefore confronted with a question very like the one that faced the alchemists. Is the self a symbol of Christ, or is Christ a symbol of the self? Okay, so what's he arguing here? So it seems to he's saying that the prevalence of the symbolism of the philosopher's stone marked a certain change It marked a development in the symbolism. And he's saying that that development had to do with the inclusion of Christ within the sphere of immediate inner experience, and that the symbolism of the Philosopher's Stone helps to express this, that it's possible to conceive of Christ in different ways, which may or may not be, which may be more or less connected with our inner experience. And he feels that the symbolism of the Philosopher's Stone and its development over the centuries of alchemy express the trend in that direction toward including Christ in the realm of immediate inner experience, and they also make him appear as the figure of the total man. And so he's saying that this association, this connection that the alchemist saw between the Philosopher's Stone and Christ reveals or indicates his being the figure of the total man. And that this also lines up, it aligns with the evidence for the existence of these symbols of the self, these symbols of totality that we see in people's unconscious imagery. So there's a way that the self is a sort of center of awareness that is between conscious and unconscious, that we're sort of latently aware of. And the symbols which point to it are symbols of totality, including that of the Philosopher's Stone, increasingly Christ. It's saying that as Christ became associated with the Philosopher's Stone, he sort of included more directly within the sphere of our experience, and also points more obviously to the self as archetype, as that which we experience within. So these symbols, they all seem to converge: the significance of Christ, that of the Philosopher's Stone, and of the self. So which is a symbol of the other? I think I won't comment on that. I'll simply give what Jung says himself, which is that here he has argued that Christ is a symbol of the self. And why? Well, let's hope that he will tell us. He says, I've tried to show how the traditional Christ image concentrates itself. Sorry, it says the traditional Christ image concentrates upon itself the characteristics of an archetype, the archetype of the self. Okay, so there's a way that this Christ image has a lot of a certain archetype is concentrated upon that image. That's what he's tried to show. That's how he feels that what Christ is a symbol of that which converges upon it, namely the archetype of the self. It's a kind of consolating point for that archetype. That doesn't reduce the nature of Christ to the fact that Christ is also a symbol of the self, doesn't take anything away from Christ, it seems to me. Anyway, he's going on. My aim and method do not purport to be anything more in principle than, shall we say, the efforts of an art historian to trace the various influences which have contributed toward the formation of a particular Christ image. Thus we find the concept of the archetype in the history of art as well as in philology and textual criticism. The psychological archetype differs from its parallels in other fields only in one respect. It refers to a living and ubiquitous psychic fact, and this naturally shows the whole situation in a rather different light. One is then tempted to attach greater importance to the immediate and living presence of the archetype than to the idea of the historical Christ. As I've said, there is among certain of the alchemists too a tendency to give the stone, the lapis, priority over Christ. So he's essentially saying, hey, so Christ is pointing to this archetype of the self, and the self is actually something that's an immediate and living presence. It's a living and ubiquitous psychic fact that people experience, even in an unconscious way, and that this gives it an importance that he may not attribute to the idea of the historical Christ. Yes, so to summarize, the archetype of the self has characteristics that are concentrated upon the figure of Christ. This archetype of the self is a living and ubiquitous psychic fact, and that's primarily what he's concerned with, although both Christ and the self are important. As I have said, there is, yeah, among certain of the alchemists too, a tendency to give the Lapis priority over Christ. Since I'm far from cherishing any missionary intentions, I must expressly emphasize that I am not concerned here with confessions of faith, but with proven scientific facts. If one inclines to regard the archetype of the self as the real agent, and hence takes Christ as a symbol of the self, one must bear in mind that there is a considerable difference between perfection and completeness. The Christ image is as good as perfect, at least it is meant to be so, while the archetype, so far as known, denotes completeness but is far from being perfect. It is a paradox, a statement about something indescribable and transcendental. Accordingly, the realization of the self, which would logically follow from a recognition of its supremacy, leads to a fundamental conflict, to a real suspension between opposites, reminiscent of the crucified Christ hanging between two thieves, and to an approximate state of wholeness that lacks perfection. He's about to use a word teleiosis, which means completion, perfection, or fulfillment. And he says, to strive after teleiosis in the sense of perfection is not only legitimate, but is inborn in man as a peculiarity, which provides civilization with one of its strongest roots. This striving is so powerful, even, that it can turn into a passion that draws everything into its service. Natural as it is to seek perfection in one way or another, the archetype fulfills itself in completeness. And this is a fulfillment of a quite different kind, where the archetype predominates, completeness is forced upon us against all our conscious strivings, in accordance with the archaic nature of the archetype. The individual may strive after perfection, in the sense of be you therefore perfect, as also your heavenly Father is perfect. But that individual must suffer from the opposite of his intentions, for the sake of his completeness. Okay, a lot was just presented. He gives a final sentence which summarizes this, and that's from Romans 7:21, 7:21. I find then a law that when I would do good, evil is present within me. So this is really what he's pointing to. Yeah, so the idea is that the main difference between the Christ as a symbol and the self is that Christ is about perfection, whereas the self is about wholeness, and that we don't know what it is. It's a statement about something indescribable and transcendental. And he feels that although we have this sort of natural tendency to move toward perfection, and that that's okay, that it's really wholeness or completeness which fulfills this archetype of the self. And so he feels that recognition of the self as superior in some way, um, as having qualities like greater power than one, something like that, qualities that we might attribute to deific forces. Recognition of the self as superior leads to a fundamental conflict, and there's a conflict which is equivalent to being crucified between the opposites. That very much happened to Christ, right? And so it seems to be that this archetype consolates within us. It's the symbol of quaternity, it's the crucifixion, and it's leads to an approximate state of wholeness that is very much imperfect. So the idea being that one's perfection is fulfilled in Christ, while one's wholeness is fulfilled in the self. So it seems that although we have this natural tendency to seek for perfection through Christ or in another way, that we seek that of our own will, but when we do, that our own completeness or wholeness will sort of, in a corresponding way, be forced upon us from the unconscious. As Jung said, natural as it is to seek perfection in one way or another, the archetype fulfills itself in completeness, and this is a fulfillment of quite another kind. Where the archetype predominates, completeness is forced upon us against all our conscious drivings, in accordance with the archaic nature of the archetype. The individual may strive after perfection, but must suffer from the opposite of his intentions for the sake of his completeness. Okay, then, let's continue. Only a page and a half. The Christ image fully corresponds to this situation. Christ is the perfect man who is crucified. One could hardly think of a truer picture of the goal of ethical endeavor. At any rate, the transcendental idea of the self that serves psychology as a working hypothesis can never match that image, because although it is a symbol, it lacks the character of a revelatory historical event. Like the related ideas of Atman and Tao in the East, the idea of the self is at least in part a product of cognition, grounded neither on faith nor on metaphysical speculation, but on the experience that under certain conditions, the unconscious spontaneously brings forth an archetypal symbol of wholeness. From this, we must conclude that some such archetype occurs universally and is endowed with a certain numinosity. And there is, in fact, any amount of historical evidence as well as modern case material to prove this. These naive and completely uninfluenced pictorial representations of the symbol show that it is given central and supreme importance precisely because it stands for the conjunction of opposites. Naturally, the conjunction can only be understood as a paradox, since a union of opposites can be thought of only as their annihilation. Paradox is a characteristic of all transcendental situations because it alone gives adequate expression to their indescribable nature. Okay, so Christ embodies the self as a revelatory historical event. The self is a universal and numinous archetype which arises spontaneously from the unconscious across cultures and across times, including in the figure of Christ. And this kind of transcendental I would connect this with mystical experience, transcendental experience. It's a kind of paradox is what describes this. The symbols, yeah, the self stands for the conjunction of opposites. It's that which is beyond duality. And the symbols point to that. Symbols of the mandala, other symbols of the self. As he said, paradox is a characteristic of all transcendental situations because it alone gives adequate expression to their indescribable nature. And then he says, whenever the archetype of the self predominates, the inevitable psychological consequence is a state of conflict, vividly exemplified by the Christian symbol of crucifixion, the acute state of unredeemedness. which comes to an end only with the words consummatum est, it is finished. On this point, the inevitable psychological consequence is a state of conflict. I think yes, but I think the whole point of humanity is that the whole point of humanity is that we found a way to live with that conflict, that we have a way of alchemizing, transmuting, transforming the conflict between opposites within us. To me, this is the whole point. So it's like, yes, the predominance of that archetype when it shows itself is about the constellation of pairs of opposites being crucified between them. Yes. But I don't think that has to be an experience like the experience of being crucified. Inevitably, it is because life is suffering and it's painful to be caught between heaven and earth. It's painful to live in the human sphere. But I wouldn't want to say, well, I don't know. I mean, there's something about this which is like it's not necessarily a desirable condition, and I think we talked earlier about the goal of these traditions being the redemption or fulfillment of the soul in some way. And I think part of the idea, especially as connected with what it was like the awakening of the third sonship through the body, by reference to the figure of Jesus as prototype, the idea is that further revelation has a saving power, you know, and that um, consolating the archetype of the self need not be inherently painfully crucifying, although it may be. It can also be like there was a certain amount of divinity and grace, revelation that went along with Christ, right? Not only his crucifixion, not only his passion. And we're sorely lacking for some revelation, I think. Don't you think? Because the whole point is that we're unconscious. The whole point of regarding us this way is that we are waiting for not Christ to come and save us, but further further revelation. Um, and I'm not saying that passivity is the right way to respond to this, but I guess I'm saying that yes, although the manifestation of the archetype of the self, although the experiencing of that archetype can involve the experiencing of profound inner conflict, I think for me it's from out of a condition of inner conflict that the experiences of the self naturally arise. And I think Jung has written about that extensively. So yes, it does. I would more put it that the state of being bound by and between opposites is part of the human condition. This is part of what I think that we're here to do, to transmute and alchemize these different binary splits in the world. And I think the way that we do, yes, it's painful, but the way that we heal and transmute those splits within our nature and the nature of the world is by manifesting this very symbol, is by giving rise to, well, the revelation that it represents, that it points to. And I think it's really important to understand that because it's so easy to dismiss this stuff. It's so easy to, especially when he's talking about experiences which are difficult and painful, right? It's like, what does that have to do with numinosity? What does that have to do with God? But it's like, no, 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 no. It does have everything to do with it. So yes, although it's true for him to say that whenever the archetype of the self predominates, the inevitable psychological consequence is a state of conflict. Now, I'm not actually sure that that's true to say, because in some way I feel that the state of conflict comes first, and that the manifestation of the archetype of the self is actually exactly what resolves that conflict. It may also be true that its manifestation results in conflict between opposites, but it's I think the order is mixed up. but there may be a way in which the manifestation of that symbol is designed to resolve certain pairs of opposites, but also constellate other pairs. It's maybe that each, because Christ was a symbol of the self, right? But then he wasn't able to fix all the duality in our world, as we saw in this Christ and Antichrist business. Anyway, certainly Jung feels that whenever this archetype predominates, the inevitable psychological consequence is a state of conflict, vividly exemplified by the Christian symbol of crucifixion, the acute state of unredeemedness, which comes to an end only with the words consummatum est, it is finished. I really think it's really important to state my, you know, position in some, I don't know how to put it, but it's like, yeah, I feel that the manifestation of this archetype of this symbol is part of our birthright, part of what I'm trying to draw down into function, into its utility, for the sake of healing these different binary splits that we find ourselves already crucified between. And that has to involve cooperation from the other side in a certain way. It's not something to be summoned, doesn't work like that. But I feel that it has a revelatory and saving power that is not emphasized here. And I don't think he would disagree with that. Anyway, he goes on. Recognition of the archetype, therefore, does not in any way circumvent the Christian mystery. Rather, it forcibly creates the psychological preconditions without which redemption would appear meaningless. Anyway, yeah, recognition of the archetype, therefore, does not in any way circumvent Christian mystery. Rather, it forcibly creates the psychological preconditions without which redemption would appear meaningless. I think there's a way that yes, we're crucified by that archetype in a sense, but it's like that's what crucifixion is. It's not that it creates that condition, it's that that's what our condition is. That's what we're stuck in at the moment, right? And to me, the whole point of recognizing that is getting out of that. And also consciously participating in that from a more conscious, yeah, from a more awakened place, let's put it that way. And so I think that's equivalent to redemption in this context. So again, it's not about escape, and it's not exactly that crucifixion happens to us, it's that it's already happened to us, that we're crucified already, that we're in this human condition. And that the Christian mystery, as well as the awakening of the archetype of the self, can play a role in helping us through that, which we can, reasonably conceive as a redemptive process. Redemption does not mean that a burden is taken from one's shoulders, which one was never meant to bear. Only the complete person knows how unbearable man is to himself. So far as I can see, no relevant objection could be raised from the Christian point of view against anyone accepting the task of individuation imposed on us by nature and the recognition of our wholeness or completeness as a binding personal commitment. If he does this consciously and intentionally, he avoids all the unhappy consequences of repressed individuation. In other words, if he voluntarily takes the burden of completeness on himself, He need not find it happening to him against his will in a negative form. This is as much to say that anyone who's destined to descend into a deep pit had better set about it with all the necessary precautions, rather than risk falling into the hole backwards. So it seems to Jung, it seems to be the case that the idea of redemption doesn't mean that our burden is taken away. There's a way that for Jung, the burden is the burden of individuation. It's, quote, a task imposed by nature, by our nature, to realize our wholeness. And that Jung feels that this is totally compatible with the Christian mystery, with Christianity. And like as we were saying, if we conceive of the process of individuation as in some way equivalent to the redemption of the soul, or in Gnosticism, the liberation of the soul, and I would say the liberation for the sake of deeper participation, incarnation is the whole point. But the point is liberation from this, the Gnostic archons, these unconscious forces, the planetary gods, if we can practice in such a way as to release the soul from that, I would say through perspective taking, the practice of perspectival and participatory knowing. In that way, we not only, it's not only about gnosis, it's not only about participating in gnosis, it's about consolating this archetype of the self toward the experience of wholeness, which I would connect with belonging and meaning, connectedness in this context. And the idea is that by doing that, that that our individuation doesn't happen to us unconsciously. So the idea is that individuation is in some way our destiny, and that we can choose to undertake this consciously or unconsciously. And that when we undertake it consciously, this involves really assimilating different pairs of opposites that we naturally experience as a painful process. The idea is that if we don't do that consciously, then it sort of happens unconsciously. And I think that's what Jung identifies as all this evil going on in the world. And this is what he's about to express in his own way. Yeah, so individuation is a task imposed by nature to realize our wholeness, and this is totally compatible with Christianity. And that, as we were saying, the relationship with Christ is maybe a key asset in the process of the redemption of the soul. It definitely feels like descending into a deep pit, this stuff. And it's better to do so intentionally and with wisdom. I mean, Jung's whole prescription is that we go back to the depths, back to the roots, and hopefully avoid regressing in a Nietzschean way. And so doing this consciously and intentionally, yes, it's painful, but it may also be what we need. Then he says, the irreconcilable nature of the opposites in Christian psychology is due to their moral accentuation. This accentuation seems natural to us, although looked at historically, it is a legacy from the Old Testament, with its emphasis on righteousness in the eyes of the law. Such an influence is notably lacking in the East, in the philosophical religions of India and China. Without stopping to discuss the question of whether this exacerbation of the opposites, much as it increases suffering, may not after all correspond to a higher degree of truth. I should merely like to express the hope that the present world situation may be looked upon in the light of the psychological rule alluded to above. Today, humanity, as never before, is split into two apparently irreconcilable halves. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, It happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. That's the end. So what's Jung talking about here? So firstly, that the opposites are only regarded as irreconcilable because they're evaluated morally. And this is a kind of hangover from the Old Testament. It has an emphasis on righteousness. And this is a distinctly Western phenomena. But he doesn't want to comment about whether or not this split between the opposites is really the truth, I think, in a metaphysical sense. But he wants to instead, his whole point of pointing out this split condition is that we can see things as they are now in the world in that light, which is exactly what I've been trying to express all the way through everything. It's that there is a very real world situation which is reasonably conceived in terms of this split between two halves, whether that be left and right hemisphere, nature and culture, masculine and feminine, self and world. However you want to put it, it's this split. We are split in two. And there is indeed this psychological rule when we're not conscious of that within ourselves, when we feel that we're whole and it's just what's happening around us and outside us, well, we haven't assimilated that conflict, we haven't taken it within ourselves. So Jung's whole prescription is that we notice the conflict in the world and we notice that that's actually a conflict within us. And I think that we notice that by realizing the archetype of the self. We constellate this archetype within us. We tune in to the numinosity of that force of nature. And this is a process of constellating consciousness of pairs of opposites, to be able to work with them, to alchemize with opposites, to transmute those opposites into a kind of flexibility in our perspective taking and storytelling that feels like a conflicted condition because it is a conflicted condition. The idea being that if we don't take that burden upon ourselves, the burden of becoming whole, that what we do not include within ourselves, what about our own nature that we do not include within our conscious sense of who we are, happens to us, happens around us as what we call fate. Clearly, we see this connection here between the idea of the liberation of the soul, working with the soul, the work of ensoulment, and the work of redemption that has to do with releasing the soul from its unconscious influence. So there is a great correspondence between the Christian mythology, Jungian individuation, and these other esoteric traditions like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and alchemy. They're all pointing to this task of liberating the soul from influence, undue influence, and that we do that by making ourselves whole. And by all means, one's relationship with Christ can certainly help. I think the difference would be that in pursuit of individuation, one may not see that one is made whole in Christ. One may see that one is made perfect in Christ. One's perfection in relationship with Christ, one has a relationship with perfection. One's perfection is fulfilled in Christ, while wholeness is fulfilled in the self. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves. And so it seems that consciousness of the split within us is a precondition for healing any kind of split within the world. So it's quite paradoxical because it's going to feel if we take the split within ourselves, it feels as if we're torn apart. And I happen to know something of what that's like. It's not easy. but certainly wrestling with that, wrestling with the reality of our split condition, with our dual nature in an inner way, is preferable than unconsciously acting out that split, which looks like evil and destruction and chaos in the world. For me, I would simply connect to the end here that this is clearly connected with what I've been talking about. One becomes two, two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth. And what I've meant by that is that's what I mean by the manifestation of the archetype of the self in this context. It's kind of like um, from out of the recognition of the opposites which are tearing us apart, there is the space from which we recognize that conflict is the third. That we take a perspective on that conflict is evidence that there is somewhere that can witness that, something that can hold that. And I think that is the body. I think we transmute, we alchemize from out of and within the body. When we can be more aware from that place, the way that he was talking about with the incarnation of the third sonship through recognition of the prototype of Christ, that from that third, from out of the body, in which we hold those opposites, comes the one as the fourth. And so there's a way that for me, what do I mean by that? There's a way that the constellation of this sort of latent or dormant seed of our awareness within the body, it sort of brings balance to the force in a way that can take that two and turn it into a three. And then from out of that three, working together, this state of unity can be restored. And I think for me, this is kind of like what that looks like. What I've experienced that to be like is the experience of the archetype of the self in a sort of three-dimensional and participatory way. Is it possible for us to work with all this material to understand how to work toward gnosis, to work toward revelation as needed in groups for the sake of belonging, meaning, connection, and indeed development, wisdom, in the sense that wisdom is tied to aspiration and development. I mean, that so clearly goes together. To solve these splits, these huge polarities are tearing the world apart between orthodox and heterodox, between exoteric and esoteric, between the sort of the state and this is sort of at the moment it's like, Israel and Palestine or Russia and Ukraine, or we also have the culture war, left and right or masculine and feminine, good and evil, they're all expressions of the same thing. So if we take that within ourselves, if we recognize that within ourselves, it's possible to give rise to a center of awareness within the body. It's possible to experientially participate in transformative experience in such a way that we actually know how, we actually realize how to solve those split conditions. It's a way, what I'm talking about is a way to take any of those dualities, those binaries, and feel that condition and work with it. And that there is a way of using what Jung is talking about as the process of individuation, but applying it not only to individuals, but to groups, indeed to communities. I think I would understand individuation as connected to the development of any individual, quite individual, where that's not just a person, but you can have an individual community, individual group, and indeed individual humanity. I think we were talking about the awakening of the world soul at one point. And so I think each of our selves is sort of like, again, one of the jewels in Indra's net, and that we're not only awakening those jewels, but awakening the lattice work, the web that is between all of them, individual and collective aspects of the archetype of the self. Because that's the thing, it's between and beneath any duality, including individual and collective. There is a way of experiencing that firsthand in a way that makes sense of why it can be so harrowing, but also so rewarding. And so that it can induce so much creativity so as to solve real problems. The idea being that until we recognize that this split condition is what we've been caught in, we just keep going up and down these civilizational cycles. Civilization being an inherently unstable condition, and the duality split originating in a secular way in the invention of stone tools. We've been caught in this left hemispheric trap ever since we started doing that. We were seduced by the left hemisphere, and we've been cut off from participating in the world more deeply ever since. Another way to say that is that we haven't properly integrated bipedalism. We haven't properly integrated bipedalism, and that if we understand Christ's way not only as a not as a completion, but as a prototype, it's not that we all have to become crucified, it's that we all already are. I should merely like to express the hope that the present world situation may be looked upon in the light of the psychological rule alluded to above.